The COVID-19 pandemic has led hospitals everywhere to hemorrhage money. And to help stop the bleeding, health systems turn to taxpayers for help.
They delivered to the tune of nearly $2 billion here in Michigan alone. But tonight, there are questions about how that money was handed out and who got the most.
7 investigator Ross Jones is following the money trail.
There is no doubt that health systems lost money, and lots of it due to COVID-19. But did hospitals with billions in the bank deserve the most from taxpayers?
We're going to be under this cloud for at least 2 years, probably longer, and we are financially hemorrhaging.
When COVID-19 took hold this spring, hospitals like Beaumont were bursting at the seams. Some had to treat patients in hallways. Others ran out of places to store bodies. All of them took a huge financial hit.
We'll have lost revenue of almost $500 million.
To help stop the bleeding, Congress passed the CARES Act, injecting billions into hospitals across the country. Beaumont took in more than $320 million. Henry Ford got $340 million. McLaren, $146 million. And hospitals said they needed every penny.
It was critical for us to be able to pay payroll, buy pharmaceuticals, pay our utility bills.
But how much money a hospital got wasn't based on how much they needed. Instead, it was based on how much they typically earned. It didn't matter if you had nothing in the bank or were sitting on billions, and some in Michigan were.
What's the purpose for a not-for-profit hospital to have large surpluses other than for this kind of an emergency?
Robert Berenson is a fellow at the Urban Institute and an expert in healthcare finance. He says the CARES Act bailed out mammoth healthcare providers first and smaller rural hospitals that were already struggling last.
There was no reason to get this money out as an emergency to hospitals that had many days of cash on hand.
At the end of March, Beaumont had over $2 billion in cash and investments. McLaren and Henry Ford had about $2.2 billion. Spectrum Health, based in Grand Rapids, had the most at $4.2 billion in cash and investments, enough to run the health system for 246 days.
This situation has done is it has shown the light on the inequities about hospital funding.
Jennifer VANSKIVER works at North Ottawa Community Health System, a small hospital with under 500 employees. They were struggling before the pandemic and were late to receive any federal funds at all. The $1.2 million they did get didn't offset the nearly $6 million they lost.
Especially with smaller hospitals, that's not unique to ours, but you don't typically have huge cash reserves or the ability to forever rely on investment income to make up their shortfalls.
Ultimately, it comes down to it's not a great look.
NIALL BRENNAN is the CEO of the Healthcare Cost Institute in Washington. He doesn't blame Michigan hospitals for accepting the federal funds because they all lost money, and back in April, no one knew if the surge would last weeks or months. Only recently have revenues approached normal levels. But where he does fault hospitals is for accepting federal funds and still furloughing or laying off employees. Beaumont, Henry Ford, McLaren, and Spectrum all did, many in large numbers.
Maybe a CFO can look at the bottom line and say that, we're not utilizing these people and therefore they need to be furloughed. But this was an extraordinary time for our country. And if an organization could afford to keep their workers paid, I think they should have made every effort to do so.
All the hospitals we spoke to said furloughs were necessary to ensure they'd survive longer than just the next year. The money they did get didn't offset their total losses, and they're preparing for a second wave, which is still very possible, if not likely. If it comes, another hospital bailout is possible too. Experts like Robert Berenson say how much hospitals get should depend, at least in part, on how much they already have.
What are you saving it for, if not for this very bad rainy day?
Beaumont, Spectrum, and McLaren all declined on-camera interviews for this story. Only Henry Ford Health System agreed to talk to us. All the hospitals point out that most of their furloughed employees have been brought back, though some of the cuts are permanent. You can read all the hospitals' statements on our website right now at WXYZ.com. We're in Royal Oak. I'm Ross Jones, 7 Action News.
All right, thank you so much, Ross.